We're going to move along with our program now. Our next speaker is a renowned scientist, humanist, and artist who truly exemplifies interdisciplinarity. He was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Grant, in 1981, which further encouraged his multidisciplinary activities. He is currently professor of physiology at Michigan State University, where he studies the evolution of metabolic control systems, autoimmune diseases, drug development, and the creative processes in the sciences and the arts. He exhibits his artwork both in group and solo shows, and he serves as an editor for Leonardo, for whom he edits a regular section on art science. He has written 4 books, including one with Michelle Root-Bernstein, titled Sparks of Genius, the 13 Thinking Tools of the World's Most Creative People. Please welcome Professor Robert Root-Bernstein.
What a pleasure to be here. Okay. So I want to start out by giving you a little conundrum. It's going to start out sounding like a joke. It's not. It's really a puzzle. And it goes like this. So a physician and an engineer and a dancer and an artist walked into a bar. And she ordered a drink. And there's the conundrum. And I'm going to come back to that at the end of my talk. Now, this group may be able to understand that without too much problem. I'm not getting any forward. Where's the control here? Here we go. Okay. Yes? No? It still doesn't like me.
Sorry.
Nope.
This is the clicker, correct? Oh, it's working now. Sorry.
It's working now. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Outline of my talk here. Basically, I'm going to address the evidence that integrating arts and science are actually useful, especially in this case, I'm going to be focusing on the STEM side. I think one of the problems in thinking about evidence is that people want some kind of critical experiment, which there isn't going to be, and in fact, they don't exist in science either. Really, we understand things because we have a spectrum of different ways of looking at things, all of which enlighten and bring, as a spectrum does, made up of all the different colors, this bright white light at the center here. So I'm going to go through quickly, and these are just going to be tastes of, and this is all ongoing research. There's not nearly enough at this point. But first, large-scale statistical studies, then individual case studies to see what's going on within those statistical studies, looking at the cognitive similarities between the arts and the sciences, successfully integrated STEM experiments where they have actually integrated the arts already in the curriculum. I'm then going to flip it over, and I'll explain why when I get there, and look at arts, crafts, and design people as actual scientists and inventors, and you'll see why I'm going to do that. And it actually has 2 purposes, because that's going to lead into looking at arts, crafts, and design as a way of getting people into STEM subjects as professionals who otherwise would not get through a program. So let's start with the large-scale statistical studies. Probably the biggest one we've done so far is to look at all the Nobel Prize winners, 510 of them, compared them to a survey of Sigma Xi, which are pretty much anybody who can become a scientist can join this group. And basically what we found here is on the right-hand side there, the Nobel Prize winners are about twice as likely to be a photographer, 4 times more likely to be a musician. But the really interesting parts are when you get to being an artist, a craftsman, creative writers, performers such as actors, theater directors, things like that. Here, the Nobel Prize winners are 15 to 25 times more likely. And this is the most conservative interpretation of the data. It may actually be much greater than that. We've also looked at the Royal Society, the National Academy of Sciences, and so forth, and the differences are very similar. We've also looked at the National Academy of Engineering. We can actually differentiate within that group itself. Of course, these are all very high performing people. Those who are most likely to have patents and to have started their own companies by whether they have ongoing activities with crafts, photography, recreational electronics and computing, music, and things like that. We've looked at a similar kind of study in Michigan where we looked at Michigan engineers, compared them to a group who are actually funded by the state to develop their patents into companies. So these are the entrepreneurial types. You can see from all the starred bars there that they're much more likely, if they found a company, have patents, to be involved in ceramics, dancing, metalwork, mechanics, painting, drawing, and so forth. So the creative people who are entrepreneurial, who are driving our economy, have ongoing arts and crafts and design activities. There's another study I'll just point out, and there are many, many more, but this is one of the largest, 7,000 Americans. When you look at Americans, just the general population, who are filing patents, again, there's a very high correlation between filing a patent and having had a strong arts background in your education. All right, the problem with statistics, obviously, is that statistics are simply correlations. We don't know for sure that this is what's driving things, so we want to dive into the actual case studies. And again, I'm just going to give you a taste. We've got about 150 of these done. Most of them are, I think only about 24 of them are published at this point. I'm going to have to live to about 104 if I'm going to get them all out there, so maybe I'll make it. George Washington Carver, we all know him as the Peanut Man, one of the greatest inventors ever. What often gets left out of the story was he was also a world-famous painter. He won international competitions. And I just went through all of his patents, and it turns out that 2/3 of them are actually for paints, dyes, and specific types of paper to be used for that kind of use. In other words, his art was driving his inventing. Alexis Carrel got a Nobel Prize for inventing the techniques that allow us to suture together major organs and arteries. He literally went and got trained by the best lace makers in France and took their techniques directly and literally directly into the surgical theater. Louis de Broglie, Nobel Prize for looking at wave-particle duality. He was a very fine violinist. When the Bohr model comes out saying maybe these electrons are really standing waves going around a nucleus, he sits there and says, as a musician, if they're standing waves, they have to have overtones and harmonics. I can look at the size, I can calculate them. 2 years later, people actually measured those overtones. That's where he gets his Nobel Prize. Direct analogy. Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgett, one of the very first women to get a Nobel Prize for her crystallography work, was homeschooled. Her parents made her write out in her own words all of her lessons, everything she read. She had to illustrate them. They taught her how to paint. By the time she was 16, she was doing the professional illustrations for her parents' archaeological work. That's in the center there. That's one of her drawings she did when she was 16. She said that that kind of training was what it made it possible for her to actually see what was going on in these very mathematical crystallography experiments, and without that, she would not have been able to become a scientist. Physicist Jacob Shaham of Columbia University told me that he learned how to do his physics by taking acting lessons, that as he was being introduced to physics and being introduced to things like Maxwell's equations, he suddenly realized they were a script. And just like a script, you had to bring them to life. I've talked to people at Caltech and MIT. Every student can do the math who gets into those programs. Only half of them know how to translate those scripts into what's actually going on, and that's where they lose most of their students. They literally can't enact what the equations mean. So we've already mentioned at this conference a little bit earlier, Alan Alda, people like that. We know that this is teachable, and that's the important part. Each of those case studies gives us a clue as to what we can take into the classroom more formally. So just to sum up what these sets of studies show us, basically STEM professionals get from arts, crafts, and design things like new materials to work with, new techniques, methods, and tools, new kinds of phenomena to study, new structures they've never seen. I'll illustrate some of those a little bit later on. Experience navigating the creative process because it's identical across fields. Everybody uses the same creative process. Aesthetic principles. A great experiment is like a great piece of art, and many of the scientists literally use exactly the same aesthetics in evaluating each. Recreation. We should not underestimate the value of taking your brain out of its normal place and going someplace else, because when you get involved in recreation, you start playing, you recreate other things, and by recreating, you often learn how to create and create new things. And then finally, of course, we've seen in the last couple of days, recording, communication techniques, analytical techniques, and so forth. All right, so the other critical thing that you get out of all these studies is that every single person we looked at can be described as having an integrated network of enterprise. Now, what does that mean? We know, top image here, that we can require students in lots of different areas to take their humanities, and they can take their arts, and they can take their music, and they take their science, and they take their engineering, and they remain independent strands. They never weave them together. If we don't weave it together, it doesn't mean anything. In every case we've looked at, the people knowledgeably and with forethought integrated their interests and their knowledge to make new things happen. That's part of what has to happen educationally if we're going to make these things work. All right, how do you do that? So again, looking at a lot of case studies, what my wife and I ended up drawing out are what we call 13 tools for thinking. So these first came out of my study simply of scientists in my first book, Discovering. I kept interviewing people, looking in lab notebooks, and they kept describing things which we then realized everybody across all creative fields are using. Things like everybody observes. Everybody has to be able to image their observations, whatever form they used, whether it's tactile or visual or whatever. You abstract out the critical information. We saw all of this yesterday. Find patterns in it. Develop new kinds of patterns. All these link into everything we've been talking about at this conference so far. But then there were some that are a little bit odder, like proprioceptive thinking. How does it feel? Okay, your feelings, your emotions, all those things are part of the creative process. Playing, empathizing. We heard a comment earlier about empathizing. I'll come back to that. You have to model these things. You have to take a set of data and transform it into what it means and so forth. So in the end, one of the critical things is integrating all this or synthesizing it. And the outcome of everything we've talked about here is you have to know what you feel and feel what you know. So really what I'm talking about with these 13 thinking tools is what we could call intuition. Let me show you just briefly a couple examples of how these work across disciplines. So here's Picasso abstracting. He did a series of bulls over 3 years, and it took him 3 years to figure out what the abstraction of a bull was. He started with something very realistic on your upper left-hand side here, tried all sorts of different things. What is bullness? Because I don't want to draw a bull, a real bull. I want to draw what the essence of a bull is. And it's a process of taking things away. That's what abstracting is until you leave that essence. Well, it turns out that scientists literally describe in exactly the same words what they are doing. And I'll give you an example here because it's nice and visual, but Nico Tinbergen, very fine photographer, a cinematographer. He actually wrote a couple of children's books, which he illustrated himself. One of them called Clue is still in print if you want to buy it. He was one of the founders of animal behavior ethology. And one of his first discoveries was looking at baby chicks, gull chicks, who would peck at their mother's beak for food. Now, it looks really simple, but when you start thinking about it, what's the factor here? Are they pecking because it smells like food? Are they pecking because it's sort of Pavlovian? This is where the food comes from, so I get used to just pecking at the beak because that's where I get fed. It's a big yellow beak. Is the yellowness essential? There's a little red dot there. Could that be somehow involved? Who knows? So he literally does what Picasso did. First, on the left-hand side there, he makes a very realistic one. I couldn't find a color photo, unfortunately. But it was a realistic-looking beak. He puts it in front of the chick. It pecks. He now got rid of one of the variables. He knows it's not smell because there's no smell there. But it still could be the yellowness. It could be the fact that it looks like a beak. It could be all sorts of things. Long story short, after making hundreds of these and testing dozens and dozens of chicks, he finds out that he can take anything away except red, and in fact, he can give them a red ball, a red pencil, a red anything, they'll peck at red. Food is red for a baby chick, okay? That's the essence in the same way that Picasso was looking for boldness. Empathizing. We know what empathizing is when the doctor empathizes with you. We know what empathizing is in lots of other cases. Artists actually develop whole ways of thinking about it in new ways. And this is one of my favorite examples of empathizing, Isamu Noguchi's core. It's about 6 feet high. He's literally made a hole in the center there. And he says, go ahead, put your head into it, and then you will know what the inside of a stone feels like. That is just so cool. Inside of a stone feels like. I never thought of being a stone. And the really crazy thing was then I started finding scientists talking about this. My mentor, Jonas Salk, said, I asked him, how did you solve the polio problem? He said, I became the virus. I want to know what the virus was going to do. And then I became the immune system and said, how am I going to respond to this thing? Joshua Lederberg said every scientist has to learn how to do this. Probably the best example, Barbara McClintock spoke of a feeling for the organism. And there's actually a biography of her called that. And she says, as you look at these things, they were the genes she was studying, they become part of you and you forget yourself. It's almost a Zen-like experience here. It surprised me that I actually felt that these were my friends. And the main thing is you forget yourself. Think about what we teach our science students about being completely objective. This is not objective at all. And yet this is where the creativity comes in science. It comes from the same place that artistic creativity comes from. One final example, playing. We were doing a study of science textbooks. Things like empathizing are proscribed. Playing is either not mentioned or you're told never to do this because you're wasting time, that kind of stuff. I don't know a scientist who doesn't play. Great scientists all play. So, example, Alexander Fleming, one of the most playful guys you'll ever meet. One of the crazy things he did was to play with painting. Not very good, right? But let's cut him a little bit of slack because this is with a twist. This is not written with ink, but with bacteria which develop color as they grow. This is really tough, actually, because different bacteria grow at different rates, in different media, at different temperatures. Sometimes they need carbon dioxide. Sometimes they need oxygen. I mean, there are all sorts of problems here. Many of them interfere with each other. The amount of technical knowledge he developed by his game and the need to actually develop a palette, he literally had a palette, meant that he would leave his cultures open in order to let them get contaminated, find whatever came, and guess what came? Penicillium notatum. And when it killed off a bunch of pathogenic bacteria as a side response, he was in the unique position of knowing that this was completely unique because he'd been doing this for 20 years and never seen anything like it. Okay? He had specific knowledge through playing he couldn't have had any other way. All right, so there are many other tools. I don't have time to go through them, but the really critical point here is, first of all, these develop intuition. You understand things from the inside out. You feel them. And that then gives you a conceptual basis for integrating across disciplines because they're all working the same way and using those tools. And finally, one of the most useful aspects of this for the teacher is it gives you a common language. And this is one of the biggest problems across disciplines is we need a common language for talking about how to integrate. All right, so fourth, successful integrated arts, crafts, and design with STEM pedagogies. So we now that my wife and a student and I went through and decided to look at all the studies we could find where people actually put arts, crafts, design into a formal curriculum. We looked for what we called high-quality studies, and we did this under the SEED, aspects of SEED, which Carol Strohecker, Carol Lafayette, and Roger Molina, who's here, got to network people together, so we thank them for their support here. What we found was there are less good studies than we would like, but critically, every time somebody came up with a way of integrating arts, crafts, and design into a STEM curriculum, there was always a bridge. Okay? And the reason for having a bridge I will make apparent to you, I hope. So here's just a visual analogy here. So we have the art of Ken Snelson. You can go see him on the mall here. His needle sculpture is on the mall here. Engineers have used his new kinds of sculptures to actually build bridges. They did so through the medium of the principle, which is tensegrity. And I'm not going to try to explain that here today, but the point is they didn't take the art and try to apply it. They took the principle by which the art is made and used that as the bridge to make a bridge. This is what we found in every study. Every one of the high-quality studies we looked at where they could demonstrate real STEM effects always had a bridge. Okay? Most of these were involved with graduate and college-level studies. There are very few K through 12 studies that have been done well, which is really sad. We need a lot more information here. We found that if you didn't have a good bridge, if you simply just said, I'm going to put an artist into a biology class and they're going to teach them how to draw and this will make them better biologists, that doesn't work. You have to have a goal. You have to understand which art you're using, why you are using that art, and how it will influence a specific pedagogical goal at the end. Those are fairly simple things to do. It's amazing how many people haven't. For those of you who know about near transfer, far transfer issues, can art actually affect, a science or something because they're not near disciplines? This concept of a bridge just totally eliminates it. The bridge creates literally a bridge. Everything is now near if you can show that you bring them together. This is very much like a wrinkle in time, right? We simply bring the stuff together. All right, so overall, what we did find is when done well, arts, crafts, and design integrated into STEM learning really, really improves the STEM outcomes. All right, there are still lots of skeptics, right? We still don't have as much data as we'd like to have. And one of the arguments that people kept raising as I would go and give talks about this would be, well, if the arts actually have these incredible tools and they actually have this knowledge and they can be so useful to STEM professionals, then why aren't the artists making the discoveries and the inventions? Now, my first response to that was, that's really stupid. I mean, that's like asking Beethoven to be a Nobel Prize winner in physics, or Borodin to be a chemist, or wait, Borodin was a chemist. Okay. So let's go and look and see whether maybe there are people who have bridged these different disciplines who are really recognized as being mainly an artist or a performer or a dancer or something like that. And I'm currently finishing a book called Modern Leonardos, Artists, Musicians, and Performers as Scientists and Inventors. Here's a list of the different kinds of things that I've found that these artists, musicians, and performers actually give to the sciences and to engineering and some other areas. Theories, analogies, structures, materials, techniques, methods, phenomena, discoveries, devices, innovations, all sorts of things. There are at least 150 really fundamental. I'm only going to put about 50 in the book just as being illustrative. Again, there's more information here that we can actually use, and I'll just give you a taste. Structures, I already talked about Ken Snelson and bridge building, engineering, things like that. It's also had his tensegrity concept has had a tremendous effect on cell biology, where two young men, one of them's in the National Academy, Don Ingber, one of my colleagues, Steve Heidemann, used to build tensegrity sculptures in graduate school just for fun. suddenly realized that those principles could be used to understand cell structures. Innovations. So young Moo Kim played some of Lajar and Hiller's music yesterday morning. He's well known as one of the real breakthrough computer music people. What people really don't realize is he actually invented the first artificial intelligence and expert systems, computational models. He got written out of the histories because the guys at MIT and Bell Labs are the ones who wrote it. And it sort of looks bad when a musician beats you to what you're supposed to be doing professionally. Techniques. Heather Ackroyd, Diane Harvey wanted to make art out of strange material called grass. And particularly wanted to see if you could use it as a photographic material. We've all seen if you put something on a piece of grass, it turns yellow underneath. The problem is that it wilts and fades and goes away so fast you can't exhibit it. So how do you make this into an art form? So they went to some people in England who were working on something called stay green grass. Stay green grass turns out to be really important. The greener grass is and the longer it stays green, the more nutritious it is. So this has a huge impact on farming, things like that. And the two groups got together. They worked with each other. We now have the stay green grass photographs. We also have an entirely new way to screen for high nutrition plants because the artists knew all these techniques for analyzing images, which had never been brought into botany. And this is now saved somewhere around $1 billion and speeded up by 1,000-fold the screening of various versions of plants for their nutrition. Very effective economically. Here's another huge breakthrough which has saved lots of money. NEA funded, I want to point that out, for about $30,000. It led to a $15 billion a year phytoremediation industry, and this was started by artist Mel Chin. Mel Chin does strange things like he wanted to go out and remediate contaminated soil. He had read in some article that plants sometimes take up heavy metals, so maybe they could take them out of the soil. Various botanists sort of played around with this, but nobody had actually tried it. He convinced someone in I believe it was the EPA, to actually try this. It works. And so for $30,000, we now have this whole industry which is remediating what we've done to the environment. New geometries, just briefly. Wallace Walker was an artist doing a standard Bauhaus type of exercise. Take a piece of paper, fold it, do something interesting with it. Okay, you couldn't cut, you couldn't do anything, all you could fold. He invented this object, which they're now called kaleidocycles. A mathematician happened to come by and looked at it and said, I've never seen anything like that. And then she started investigating and realized no one had ever seen anything like this. This is an entirely new form of geometry. There are at least 5 artists who have invented new objects, new forms of geometries, new kinds of structures that have never existed before, which mathematicians are now studying. Materials. Sculptor Patricia Billings used to work in plaster. She was making a wonderful, sculpture of a swan, happened to knock it over, 6 months of work gone, very angry. She goes off and she invents a new kind of plaster. It's called Geobond. It turns out not only can't you break it, it's almost bulletproof. You can't burn it. You can put it under a rocket, literally, and it will not burn. This is totally renovating in the whole building industry. And finally, inventions. Sculptor Jan de Swart, one of the very first people ever to carve in plastic. If you look at the fundamental patents in plastic inventions, things like plastic bottle caps, pass-throughs, grommets, every single one of them is from him, because he was the only person who had the tools and the knowledge of how to use plastics in the 1930s and 40s, because he was an artist, solving art problems, not because he intended to be an inventor. All right, so I'm going to quickly go through the how arts, crafts, and design improve underrepresenting STEM learning, and then give you my conclusions here. So I just want to point out that the people I just mentioned, Wallace Walker, Patricia Billings, Jan de Swart, you can list a whole bunch of others, failed their science courses, their geometry courses. In fact, Wallace Walker, who invented that in geometry, failed his geometry course 3 times. These are not people who would normally make it into STEM professions. We know, for example, that kids who can't see in their heads, who don't have good imaging ability, can't survive in STEM classes. We know that if you give them drawing classes, painting classes, sculpturing classes, that they can then, without any additional tutoring in STEM subjects, suddenly succeed, okay, just by giving them that imaging. We don't know about the other 12 tools that I've talked about. There are no studies. What we do know, we're in the midst of doing a study, it's not published at this point, that minorities and women have a different spectrum of mental tool use than what I've been talking about, okay? So particularly minorities tend not to be visual. Women tend not to be visual. They're much more embodied. They're much more verbal. And these are generalizations. But what we need to do is now start looking at, can we use some of these other ways of thinking and redesign science education so that we take advantage of the strengths that these individuals have instead of trying to do it in a white Caucasian male approach. Conclusions. There's really only 3 conclusions. The first is connect. The second is connect. The third is connect. Okay, why? So one thing we just need to get rid of is this whole right brain, left brain. Roger Sperry, the guy who invented did all this stuff on right brain, left brain, was an artist. He was a poet. He did all these other things beside his science. And he says we're ambicerebral. Every normal brain is whole. It's a unified consciousness of right and left hemispheres that adds up. Remember the braiding? That's what we're looking for, the braiding. So this gets me back to my first little crazy thing that sounded like a joke. A physician, an engineer, a dancer, and an artist walks into a bar. And she orders a drink. This is Mae Jemison. And she found the perfect way to use all this. It was just being an astronaut where you need every single one of those sets of skills and you have to bring them together. We need to listen to her because she is our future. Science and the arts are not different sides of the same coin or different parts of the same continuum. Rather, they are different manifestations of the same thing. So let's make them whole again. Thank you.